Hello and welcome. Hello, Valeria. My name is Alessandro Barchiesi. I am a professor of classics at New York University. My main field is Roman poetry, Roman fiction, but I'm also interested in reception, for example. And it's my pleasure to introduce the next speaker in our Emerging Scholar presentation series. This series is organized and hosted by the NYU Center for Ancient Studies. And I'm personally grateful to Matthew Santirocco and Anna Donch for coming up with this idea for imagining and bringing this series to life. The Emerging Scholar series showcases the research of advanced PhD candidates. And we are particularly excited to engage approaches to the study of the ancient world that incorporate non-traditional materials and methods. We believe there is a lot to be learned in this aspect. And we also believe that it is important for students who are approaching their PhD and the job market to have, even more occasions for presentations, for outreach. We think we cannot have enough of those. So even if this is a modest initiative, we are hoping that this will be interesting or helpful. And so in this video, I will speak to Valeria Spacciante. Valeria is a PhD candidate at Columbia with a dissertation that she will introduce very soon, I believe. It's called Bodies of Knowledge, Literary Norms and Resistance in the Ancient Novel. Her presentation today, she will have a presentation now, is called Bodies of Knowledge, Literary Norms and Resistance in the Ancient Novel again. So Valeria, I'm giving you the field, and after that we will have time for a few comments and questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Alessandro, for your kind introduction. I would also take a moment to thank Anna Donch and everyone involved in this great initiative for having me and giving me the opportunity to present my research. I'm very happy to be here with you all today. And without further ado, I'm gonna share my screen and dig into my project. Okay, can everybody see it fine?
Yes.
All right. Great, thank you. So as Professor Barchiesi was mentioning, my project is titled Bodies of Knowledge, Literary Norms and Resistance in the Ancient Novel. And it explores the dynamic and tensions between identity formation practices and literary education in the 5 so-called ideal novels, which I will qualify in a minute, through the lens of literary commonplaces. So contrary to the very popular idea that literary commonplaces are empty signifiers, I argue that they have different impacts on each character in the novels based on identity factors like class, gender, race, citizen status, and even ethnicity. While the protagonists easily overcome these difficult narrative situations, as I will discuss in a minute, every other character is more or less severely affected. In this sense, these commonplaces actually enforce a hierarchy within the narrative based on each character's ability to survive and dominate such narrative situations. As I will show, such ability is strictly dependent on the character's social status and access to Greek education. Now, as you can see from my chapter breakdown, my work tracks a correlation between identity and narrative success through the 2 well-established narrative commonplaces of lovesickness and the heroine's apparent death. In this sense, I argue that the ancient novels exploit Greek storylines and narrative situations to secure the dominant position in the narrative of the Greek-educated main characters at the expense of other characters. And this is what I mean by literary norms in my subtitle. The 2 tropes I analyze, in fact, are solidly established in the Greek literary tradition, with many examples across multiple genres. However, as I indicate in the second part of my subtitle, the novels also offer many instances of resistance to the hierarchy which I've just outlined. For this reason, as you can see, each of my chapter on the literary trope is accompanied by a second chapter where I analyze examples of characters which trouble the narrative situation in which they're involved and ultimately turn it to their advantage. So by reading norm and resistance as embedded in the same narrative, my goal is not only to foreground the characters which these same tropes are meant to suppress, but also to offer a more complex and critical understanding of the relationship between the ancient novels and the set of Greek literary paradigms which they work, since they simultaneously use them to support and to subvert the social hierarchy. Now, before getting into my argument, let me briefly contextualize my corpus. Among the many fictional texts in prose of the imperial era, there is a subset of 5 narratives written in Greek, which appear to be consistent in themes and structures. They are therefore usually grouped together and defined as ideal novels. In Simon Gold's definition, quote, they are all love stories in which an aristocratic young man and young woman of exceptional beauty fall in love, are separated, and experience multiform adventures in the pursuit of the perfect love. More specifically, these novels are Chariton's Caleroi, Xenophon of Ephesus' Ephesian Tale, Longus' Daphnis and Chloe, Achilles Statius' Leucippe Cleidophon, and Heliodorus' Aethiopica. As for the chronology, it is uncertain, spanning from as early as the 1st century AD for Caleroi to even the 8th century AD for Heliodorus' Aethiopica. Each novel presents several dating issues, but they all solidly belong to the imperial era, with most scholars dating Caleroi and the Official Tale somewhere between the 1st and 2nd century AD, and Daphnis and Chloe, Leucippe and Cleidophon, and Aethiopica somewhere between the 2nd and 4th century. As Gold here remarked, these novels revolve around the love story between 2 young and beautiful lovers, both coming from influential families. Falling in love at first sight at the beginning of the novel, they then go through a series of hurdles, including being kidnapped by pirates, torture, enslavement, apparent death, and as many gruesome things as you want, to be reunited at the end of the story. As you can imagine, this text cohesion in themes and narrative structures proved to be a particularly fertile ground for my interest in commonplaces. Now, apart from the structural and thematic similarities, there is one more common trait which I find extremely fascinating, which is displacement. Displacement is a constant narrative thread for these plots, whose characters move around the eastern side of the Roman Empire without ever getting close to its political center, namely Rome, or its cultural/symbolic center, which is mainland Greece, given that these novels flourish in a culturally Greek environment. Along this journey, the characters come across many different people from the most disparate cultural and ethnic backgrounds. Despite the extremely diverse background from which these novels emerge, they still engage with Greek literature and cultural practices deeply, to the point that many scholars ascribe the 5 idiom novels to the Second Sophistic movement. In fact, the novel's authors displayed great familiarity with the so-called paideia, the Greek learning curriculum which became more and more important for securing elite identity under the Roman Empire. As scholars like Barbara Borg, Ewan Bowie, Tim Whitmarsh, Thomas Schmidt, Samuel Swain have noticed, paideia from the 2nd century AD onwards was not only a set of Greek texts studied in the school curricula throughout the empire, but it established a cultural code which the imperial elite could claim to impose their influence and secure their position in the provinces. So the ancient novels reflect this trend of claiming paideia for social capital. As Sophie Lalande pointed out, the ancient novel essentially tracks the educational journey of a young couple until they can successfully take their place into elite society, getting married and starting a life together. In her analysis, Lalande points out that Greek paideia plays a crucial role in the youth education, and the novels represent the progressive encounter and acquisition of Greek values, usually through the help of an older educated character who acts as their preceptor. Moreover, the novels themselves can be considered a product of paideia, given the impressive number of references and quotations from canonical texts like Homer, tragedy, oratory, theater more broadly, and many more. Many scholars have noted this trend. In particular, I would like to single out the contributions by Massimo Fusillo, Graham Anderson, Françoise de Toublon, Thomas Paulsen, only to mention a few. So bridging a dialogue between Lalande's considerations and the great body of scholarship on the novel's intertextuality, I conclude that the youth education in these works does not only happen on the content level, but the novel stages this learning process also via the literary form. Through the plot, the protagonists not only encounter Greek values, but they become entangled in several literary scenes familiar from Greek texts, which they must learn to recognize in order to succeed. As I said in the beginning, it is their ability to dominate these situations which set them apart from the other characters and ultimately gain them a happy ending. Now, to show you how literary commonplaces work in the novel to reinforce this hierarchy, I will rely on my most recent chapter on lovesickness. I would like to start with an example from Longos's Daphnis and Chloe. We are at the beginning of the book, more or less, and at this point in the text, Chloe starts accusing a series of symptoms which she cannot qualify. In particular, in the second part of the quote, you can see nausea, no control over eyes, inconclusive thoughts, not care for food, etc. Now, anyone familiar with Greek literature, we recognize them as love. Because of the relatively stable characterization of love sickness, scholars usually consider this commonplace as quote-unquote universal, in the sense that everyone experiences it in the same way, regardless of their background. The most influential scholar to apply this view to the ancient novel was David Constant, one we like to remember in this talk. However, though, Longos's passage complicates this universalistic view of love sickness, as it brings out two crucial aspects of love sickness as a literary situation. On the one hand, love sickness can indeed affect anybody, as we see for Chloe, regardless of their socioeconomic background. On the other hand, love sickness is a strictly codified experience, which relies on specific literary signifiers and commonplaces. It follows that while everyone experiences love sickness and love in general, only the lovers who have access to previous stories about love can interpret and overcome its symptoms. As Longos makes clear, as you can see in bold, Chloe is not able to qualify her symptoms not only because of her young age, but because she was, quote, a young girl raised in the countryside and one never heard anyone speak the name of love, end quote. So rather than a generic marker, love sickness is thus a signifier for social distinction. And for this reason, it penalizes all characters who for different reasons are not entitled to the paideia necessary to understand its rules. In Chloe's case, she eventually learns how to handle love sickness, which also corresponds to her learning about her elite descent. While the main couple experiences love sickness only temporarily and to ultimately get together, non-Hellenized characters, meaning characters who did not receive or are not entitled for any reason the Greek paideia, experience much stronger love symptoms, both because they are consistently described as lacking self-control and because their sexual desires are destined to remain unfulfilled and their love sickness uncured. Before getting into my resistance, just to give you an idea of what love sickness looks like for the main couple, and specifically for the main lover, since he is the one who most benefits from this literary situation, I've selected a passage from Caryton's Caleroy. Again, we're at the beginning of the book, and both Kyrias and Caleroy are suffering. Although note how Caleroy is suffering more, because given her gender, she cannot freely express her feelings. The maiden suffered worse because she had to keep it quiet in the text. Kyrias, on the other hand, decides to overtly confront his parents and ask them to marry Caleroy. This act is described as worthy of, quote, a good-minded and high-spirited man, end quote, given that he is able to identify the reason of his physical decay as love and find his cure in Caleroy. As a result, Kyrias and Caleroy are married a few lines later. Now, if we compare this situation to similar cases of audacity from characters from different backgrounds, we can see the double standard lurking behind love sickness. It is particularly interesting to see what happens when the lover is a foreign woman. Since she deviates from Kyrias, or any other main character, male main character in particular, along two axes, gender and race. Shelley Haley suggests using the Black feminist concept of racialized gender to theorize racially othered women's experiences in antiquity, since it accounts for the distinct identity formation processes which foreign women need to negotiate in their experiences. In her analysis of such processes, Haley points out that the essence, quote unquote, of foreign women in Imperial Rome's imagination is a lack of self-control and unbridled sexuality. In the novels, these women fall in love with the protagonist, experience love sickness, and like Kyrias, they are vocal about their feelings. However, in their case, knowledge about their symptoms and display of agency simply confirm the idea that they are sexually predatory. Fearing her uncontrollable passion, the hero thus refuses to associate with his aspiring lover, which makes her sicker and sicker until she tortures him in the attempt to win his love. We can thus see that the novels construct a self-serving paradigm meant to exclude the foreign woman from the story. Her abusive behavior confirms the prejudice about her and therefore justifies her erasure from the plot. However, it's worth noting that the foreign woman in love is expelled from the story because of her authority, which disturbs the social order as it is outlined by the novel. She's usually a queen or a woman in power, and she expresses her feelings with the same, or in some cases even more, liberty than the heroes, thus displaying agency over herself and her sentiment. To this purpose, let me briefly illustrate the case of Manto in Xenophon's Ephesian tale. Manto is the daughter of the pirate Aspertus, who holds captive the protagonist Anthea and Abrocomus in Tyre. She falls in love with Abrocomus and writes him a letter to discuss her feelings for him. The letter is the one here on my slide. As we can see from her words, she defines herself a lover, Philuse, as opposed to a virgin, Partheno. With this move, she explicitly sets herself apart from the heroine because she takes charge of her symptoms. If you remember, the heroine Caliroi, in my previous example, was suffering more than her partner because she could not declare her love. So in this sense, the foreign female lover embodies a fantasy, or rather an anxiety of female agency, but also of non-Greek power. At the end of the letter, she reminds Abrocomus that she, quotes, has his affair in her hands, end quote, and that he is in fact her slave. If on the one hand, Manto acts accordingly to the stereotype, Abrocomus rejects her and therefore she has him tortured, nevertheless she claims spaces of agency for herself. In fact, after Abrocomus' torture, she even takes up a husband who moves away. Eventually, though, her father finds out that she lied about Abrocomus only for the purpose of torturing him. But still, Manto is not punished in the novel because of her behavior. Instead, she simply disappears from the story as any other obstacles to the main couple's romance. And Manto's epilogue summarizes her ambiguous role as I presented it in the beginning. On the one side, she's the textbook foreign woman in love, fierce and angry, and therefore destined to lose. On the other side, the story still foregrounds her points of view in many situations and casts her as extremely aware of the implications of her identity, to the point that it offers her spaces of agency. Consistently, her story gets no resolution, but she simply disappears with no further questions asked about her character. From this perspective, what may seem an act of neglect turns into an act of mercy, in fact, leaving the foreign woman in love to her own existence outside the constraints of the literary conventions. So, as I have shown in my case study, literary commonplaces in the ancient novels are much more than empty signifiers, but they're in fact markers for social distinction. Tracking the way the same situation differently affects each character, we can reconstruct the social hierarchy as portrayed in these texts. At the same time, figures like the female foreign antagonist complicate this hierarchy, expressing agency and dissent through those very same narrative situations. Finally, the ambivalent approach that these texts have with these well-established narrative patterns force us to critically reconsider the novel's relationship with the Greek curriculum, as many scholars suggested in the last few years. So if on the one hand, the novels appropriate the cultural capital connected to the storylines to establish the elite, on the other hand, they display the violence implied in these identity formation processes, which endangers or destroys whoever doesn't fit the elite paradigm as it is represented by the main couple. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Valeria. That was very clear, and your research is very exciting. We don't have much time, but I hope you don't mind if I ask a few questions.
Absolutely, please.
And first of all, I think this could be important for our intended audience, which is, for example, fellow students, graduate students, future graduate students. I think that's one important question also for all graduate programs, if we are able to address it. And that is quite simply, how do you get ideas, Valeria? Because we all know that sometimes it's not simply reading all the bibliography, although your bibliography was impressive, but there are other ways that we need to discuss more. Even if we're not very interested in the ancient novel, it's still relevant to ask. For example, I don't know, random examples. Do you read Bourdieu? Do you watch Netflix? Do you take a note of commonplaces in Bridgerton or Twilight or anything else? Do you get a stimulus from the contemporary world?
I would say all of these things are true. I think that the first thing important to mention is that my background is classical reception. So I approached classical literature as an exercise in reception, which I thought, which I think was particularly productive for me. So I've always been interested, ever since I started my career, in how classical antiquity, whatever we call classics, is used to talk about, our social, our contemporary world, and like in general social hierarchy. And so I was interested in the novel exactly because it was usually understood, especially in the past, it's something that happened, especially in the past 20 years. Now it's changing, but as this like set of common tropes that just repeat themselves to make people basically, enjoy, like, popular literature, basically. And so one time I started reading Heliodorus Ethiopica, and I was reading book second with the scene of the apparent death. And I was literally haunted by this scene because it's so common also in contemporary culture. And I couldn't stop thinking about it. And at one point I realized that Abrocomes is described, Abrocomes is the main character, is described as clinged to the apparent dead body as to some force. And I realized that that force was actually the same thing that was clinging me to the text. I couldn't get out of it. And so I realized that that force might be the Greco-Roman commonplaces that come back to us. And that's how I started my old project. It's like a reception person take on the Greek novel.
All right. I have a related question on how you select your bodies of examples and text. Now, on the one side, it is quite obvious that the ancient novel, so-called idealized novel, is a group. So from that point of view, you already had like a precise set of text. But there is one trick that I use when I'm reading other people's projects or research. So I try to find out whether I formulate a reaction maybe halfway into it, and the author of the research is already there, and so has anticipated my own desires. For example, in your case, initially I kept reading, I kept thinking, oh, I wish Valeria would also address Apuleius, or maybe Lucian, or the Syrian goddess by Lucian. And when I ended reading, I realized that you do have a project to include those texts. So, so I guess your initial selection is dictated by the state of research on the Greek novel, but you also plan to include comparative material and even contemporary comparative material.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Lucian is in fact an old passion of mine. I have an article coming out on the Syrian goddess, and it's interesting because my own research on the ancient novel actually prompted me to read the Syrian goddess as a way to respond to the second sophistic Hellenocentrism by Lucian. I would like in the future to include a chapter on Apuleius and Lucian, exactly because I don't think the ideal novels, as you were rightly mentioning, are a subset, like a corpus that stands per se, but I don't think it's the only example. And my idea of including Lucian and Apuleius is exactly to like counteract this idea that they are just like parodic materials. I think the ancient novel is a much broader group than just the ideal ones, which are ideals because obviously they respond to the subset of expectations that have been laid out. So I would like to just counteract this idea. And as for the contemporary materials, in my responding chapter to each trope, I do have one contemporary material, in particular from the recent years. One novel came out in 2014 and one novel came out in 2020. And these novels explicitly thematize what I try to lay out in my reading of the ancient novels. And this is part of my broader methodological take, which is basically trying to understand the ancient world for the ancient world, but also to expand my understanding via methodologies which would make us lay bare some aspects that would be otherwise covered from a traditional approach. So, for example, there are some scholars like Daniel Padilla Peralta and Sasha Ecclestone who've been talking about the limits of the traditional philological approach, exactly because it reiterates the same structure of powers that the ancient text, produces. And this same claim was expanded recently by the introduction of the newly published volume by Marcella Ward and Mathura Machandran, which is the idea that historicism make us understand the ancient world only to a certain extent. It doesn't answer more questions that we have. So I introduced these contemporary novels in the attempt to explicitly thematize some things that the novels only read as resistance. Although the novels have this broad teleological trend, which is to still reestablish the social hierarchy at the end of the novels. While, for example, in the 2020 novel I Analyze, it starts provocatively with the death of the main character, which is not an apparent death, but the main character still comes back to the narrative to clarify some points of view, which is something that the slaves that die in place of the heroine in the apparent death trope are not allowed to do because they're slaves, and therefore they would not reverse the social hierarchy.
Okay, so let's make sure that I follow your entire project. How do you deal with some concepts which are indispensable to your analysis, but are constantly debated and redefined in contemporary culture? I'm thinking about ideas like race, identity, national identity, group identity. So what are you trying to do with the distance between the ancient world and those ideas in contemporary society?
Yeah. The first thing I want to say is that I'm still trying to understand the ancient world. Like, my main goal is to show that the novels have a more critical approach to the Greek material than we might think through the literary commonplaces. And this is something, I'm certainly not the only one to express that. This is something that novel scholars, second sophistic scholars have been talking about for at least 10 years now. In particular, I'm thinking about Tim Whitmarsh, I'm thinking about Simon Coleshill, many more, like Arade, for example, Nathaniel Arade. So there is already a big pushback among second sophistic scholars and more generally like Greek literature under the Roman Empire between the relationship between Greek identity and any other cultural identities represented in the Roman Empire. Now, when it comes to race, you're right in pointing out that it plays a big part, especially in this chapter I illustrated. But even race has been progressively accepted into classic scholarship, even though it is still, there's still pushback, it's still defined. But for example, I would like to mention Sarah Derby in her last book, which came out in 2023. And she talks about understanding race in its own terms. So it doesn't necessarily mean when we use the term race that we are talking about what we mean in contemporary words, which is usually skin color or like any other features that we might associate with race today. What Sarah Derby, for example, explains is that race in general is any outward facing characteristic that alienates someone. And that's something that I truly take heart in my project, because even though these women are not necessarily racialized in the idea that we have today, they're still alienated, they're still racialized, although on different grounds. Like, for example, in Heliodorus Ethiopica, the female lover, the foreign female lover, Arsaki, is overtly described as a Persian. We have a scene when the main character is presented at her court, and she has all the pomp and like the luxury of Persianness, and he refuses to bow to her as a Persian. And for her, the verb used is Elenize, like she's trying to be Greek. So even though she's not racialized in the sense that we would expect today, she's still othered for, cultural reasons. So that's still a way to alienate someone based on a different culture and upbringing.
Okay, thank you. The other thing I want to make sure that I understand from your argument and your project is the problem of canonicity, of canon. You do mention that frequently. And for a while, at least initially, I was confused whether you meant that what the novels are doing is operating on previous traditions, intertextuality, paideia, canonicity, or if this is something about the project of the novels themselves, because they did not become a canonical text in any moment, except probably for Heliodorus, which is also by far the best one. So when you talk about canonicity, how important is this to your strategy?
I think we have two separate issues. One thing is talking about the canon in the ancient novel, so in the sense of paideia, in the sense of like the set of texts these novels rely on to make claims. So, for example, Love Sickness is canonical in the sense that it is consistently presented throughout a set of texts in different genres. And all these texts were texts these authors or like the readers in general, the ancient novel had access to because they were very famous. I'm thinking about, I don't know, Sappho, for example, or tragedy like Phaedra. In this sense, it's canonical in the sense that it responds to the reading curriculum that was widespread over the empire. The other is a broader interest of mine, which is the idea of canonicity in the sense of the discipline of classics. I come from classical reception, as I said. My second project is about mainstream classical reception, so how we use contemporary social justice, just social justice thought to justify in retrospect the classical canon. So how we make classics feminist, for example, how we make classics like inclusive, and this raises several problems because it doesn't really address the power imbalance that sometimes the classical canon poses. So on the one hand, we have canon in the sense of like the use that the novels make of it, and the second one is a broader methodological issue that I address, which is this idea of not questioning the power imbalance that is explicitly laid out in text which we use this material.
Yes, I wish we had more time to continue because your scholarship is generous scholarship. I have identified this feature in your work, and there is also a comparatist within you, Valeria. So I think that will bear fruit in the future. But I wanted to end on a almost personal note because we happen to have been in the same institution as undergraduates. There is no conflict of interest because when I was at the Scuola Normale di Pisa, just to give you an idea, it was still possible to smoke cigarettes and even the pipe in movie theaters and even Scuola Normale seminars. So our times are very different. But I wanted to ask you, what is the difference in your experience in living in those two very different academic settings? You are now doing cutting-edge research, but in a sense, this research in the US is becoming mainstream because social justice, inclusion, and so on are becoming, dominant features in your generation. However, you have a precedent at the Scuola Normale that I find quite interesting because back then you were so young and you were, so to speak, speaking against the grain. Can you tell me a little more about your experience?
Yeah, I think this circles nicely back to your question, how I get ideas. So I was trained as a philologist, and I'm very grateful for my training. I think I had great training, but every time I read about philology as not questioning power structures, I really resonate with that experience because I got the best training in understanding some phenomenon, but not necessarily in like contextualizing them. And that's where my comparative side came about, which is all about that. It's all about taking things out of context and putting them into a new context. So that's something I have been cultivating for many years now. And I really wanted to come back to classical antiquity with this baggage that I had in the meantime. I'm not going to speak about my personal experience in Italy. There's a lot to say about that. There's a lot of like feelings involved. But what I think is important is to understand that like methodology is not just an academic practice, at least in my opinion. Methodology deeply resonates with my interest and my understanding of the world in general, which is why I'm so interested in the classical canon as a cultural experience, not just as a subset of texts. I think they still today have a lot to carry and to be dealt with in contemporary academic programs in the US and outside. And I think it's our job as classical scholars to grapple with these problems rather than just try and understand antiquity. Like, I think our understanding of antiquity needs to also resonate with whatever is happening and whatever uses of antiquity we decide to make today.
Well, I think we can call it a day, and thank you. And it really was a pleasure to talk to you. Best wishes for your research.
Thank you, Alessandro, likewise.